Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Babylon Cast. There are a few episodes on the back burner, so you'll see more of these episodes in the next coming days. There are a few things I want to mention before the video begins. First, I started a podcast called In Question with Nate Talks to You. He's a great fellow YouTuber who I can't recommend enough. We have a habit of having long conversations surrounding philosophy when the camera is off, so we figured we'd turn the camera on and see what happens. The link to the first episode is in the description of the video below, or the audio feed, whichever one you're watching or listening to. We mostly talk about our expectations and goals for the podcast. The next episode will be on veganism and animal ethics. I'm really excited for this project of ours, and I hope you guys like it. There are also more video series coming to this channel, including book reviews and critiques. Some of the books I cover will be fairly recent, while others will be older but timely. A few other things are also on the horizon that I'll be announcing later. Anyways, in this episode I speak with Dr. Gregg Caruso. He's a professor of philosophy at SUNY Corning. He's a visiting fellow at the New College of the Humanities and honorary professor of philosophy at Macquarie University. His written works include Rejecting Retributivism, Free Will, Punishment, and Criminal Justice, Free Will and Consciousness, a determinist account of the illusion of free will, and Just Desserts, Debating Free Will, which he wrote alongside the compatibilist philosopher Daniel Dennett. The links to all his works will be in the description of the video or audio feed. Should also note that he dressed up as Ali G for Halloween, which is something that cannot be ignored. In this episode, we talk about free will and the degree to which someone can be truly culpable for their behavior. We go over the concept of just desserts, which was the topic of conversation in his recent book with Daniel Dennett. We go over determinism, compatibilism, and libertarianism and their stances on free will. Libertarianism here, of course, is not to be confused with the political philosophy. We talk about varying degrees of description for social phenomena and whether we can view free will as a meta-description of human behavior. We then discuss the ethical implications that we are forced to confront if free will doesn't exist. If free will doesn't exist, what does that mean for human emotions, like a desire for retribution or justful vengeance? What does that mean for our judicial system that we have in place, which already has many problems? Free will has been a topic I've always been fascinated by, and I hope to have more conversations about this in the future. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this episode. All right, so today I am joined by the lovely Dr. Gregg Caruso. Dr. Caruso, how are you doing today?
Good, good. Thank you for having me on your show.
Yeah, I really appreciate you willing to come on. As I said before, time is a scarce resource nowadays, and it seems like just people are getting progressively busier and busier as well as me. So really genuinely appreciate being given the opportunity to speak with you. You know, as I said before, philosophy and religion are two topics that I've always been fascinated by, and I try my best to do as much research into those fields as I possibly can. One of the topics that's always interested me in has been free will. And so, you know, I think first and foremost, I'm always interested in asking philosophers and scientists in general, people sort of who are in the in the domain of trying to understand how reality works. What got you interested in philosophy and of the topic of free will and moral responsibility in particular?
Yeah, it's always a hard question to kind of go back and know how to accurately reconstruct my path. But I think most of it, like many things in life, has to do with luck. I just happened to fall in with a certain group of students when I got to college. I was actually originally studying jazz. I was a jazz performance major. I played upright bass, and that was my path. I thought I would go on and be a performer, but I took maybe one philosophy course as a humanities elective and met some students and just got really interested in it. It started to get more and more interesting to me as I took more classes. And so at some point, I can't even remember exactly, what year it was, but I switched majors to philosophy and decided not to go on to graduate school. My original interests were in philosophy of mind and cognitive science. So I originally wasn't really focused on free will. And no one at the graduate school I attended, which was the CUNY Graduate Center, was actually even teaching courses on free will at the time. I just happened to get interested on a personal level. And so I started a reading group with some other graduate students. And then eventually saw a way to combine some of the stuff I was doing in philosophy of mind with the topic of free will. And so that was what my dissertation ended up being on. And since then, I've just continued down the rabbit hole.
Mhm. That's super interesting. I remember seeing that you got an associate's in music. Um,
Yeah.
it's always interesting because there's two groups of people that I've noticed that overlap with the music industry quite a bit, or just playing an instrument, and that's physicists and philosophers. There's a huge overlap there, and I wonder why that is. I was never a musical person very much myself. I played clarinet, and that's to the extent that I got. Um, but I much like you, I was very interested in philosophy, um, and I think it must have been Critical Thinking 101 that I took in college that made me sort of start thinking seriously about getting a degree in philosophy. It might have been that one. I wish I could remember. Um, but in free will in particular, that's one that I've always been interested in because I grew up in a religious household, and being an inquisitive mind, I guess, early on, I was always conflicted on the problem of evil. And one of the big justifications that they have for why there's evil in this world is because of free will and the way in which we utilize it. And so at the time, I became interested in, whether or not we did have free will. I'm no longer religious anymore, even though I'm majoring in religious studies. But I continued to be interested in that topic because even outside the context of religion, uh, it can still be a pretty taboo thing to talk about, even among people who are secular or atheists or the nuns. The idea of questioning whether or not we have free will, to a lot of people, it seems like you're asking, why do we love? Or Paul Bloom makes this argument, who I believe wrote a blurb actually for your book Just Desserts, who's
Yeah,
a
yeah.
yeah, he's a professor of psychology at in Toronto at the moment. And he said something interesting when he was talking about his infamous book Against Empathy, where there's a lot of things in psychology in which people find kind of uncomfortable, or they raise one eyebrow at you when they realize why you're asking, like, why are you questioning, or why are you doing research into religion? Because they feel it as an attack, And similarly, free will, when you question, you know, whether or not we actually have free will, people sort of raise their eyebrows and sort of wonder to themselves, well, then why should I do anything in life if free will doesn't exist, right? How could you argue against something that's so intuitively obvious? And so I'd really like to explore the implications of living in a world in which people are under the impression that free will doesn't exist. But of course, starting off any philosophy, interview, conversation, whatever it may be, we always have to define our terms,
Yeah.
unfortunately. And so, would so I guess, is there a difference, would you say, between the way the layperson defines free will versus maybe your preferred definition of free will, one that you think more accurately gets a grasp at what exactly is happening? So, how do you view sort of your definition versus someone else's, the layperson's?
Yeah, so let me start with how I define it. So I define free will as a kind of control and action that's required for a particular type of moral responsibility. So I see free will and moral responsibility as inextricably linked. Um, and that's why I'm interested. And I think that's also why many lay people are interested, is that they find that the assumptions about free will underlie a whole bunch of assumptions about our interpersonal attitudes towards others, reactions like blame and praise and punishment and reward, and concepts like just desserts and retribution all seem sort of wrapped together. So for me, I define free will as the control needed for what I call basic desert moral responsibility. And this is, yeah, maybe a little more technical than the ordinary folk, but basically it's the kind of more responsibility that would be needed to justifiably praise and blame and punish and reward agents in a way that is purely backward looking and grounded in the notion that they deserve it. So, like the idea of just desserts, which is the title of that book with Dan Dennett, where we debate our respective views. I sort of assumed people would be more familiar with that term when we used it as the title. Um, some people think desserts or what you have after dinner, a kind of dessert. What it really means is the dessert that one, or the blame or punishment that one deserves. And so, generally speaking, people believe that for you to deserve a certain kind of harsh treatment, whether that be retributive punishment, blame, reactive attitudes like resentment or indignation or moral anger, we generally think agents must be free or have a certain kind of control over their actions such that they would be deserving of these reactions. So that's how I define it. Again, in this way, free will is the kind of power ability an agent would have in order to justify certain types of desert-based judgments, attitudes, treatments, like, again, resentment, indignation, moral anger, blame, punishment. I think ordinary folk think there's a connection between free will and moral responsibility. I think ordinary folk generally think agents are free and therefore deserving of these types of attitudes. Where issues may get a little bit murky is, what people think is needed to satisfy the control needed to ground these kinds of actions. So I want to leave that open. So I want to give a definition that's neutral and doesn't bake into the cake a particular account of free will. I don't want it to assume what's called a libertarian account of free will or a compatibilist account of free will. I want a definition that all parties can agree to, those that accept and reject the notion of free will, and then debate whether or not we have that kind of free will. I think ordinary folk are generally libertarian, and that's not political libertarianism. It's a kind of metaphysical view that says agents are free, but they have the kind of free will that require that agents are not determined, the falsity of determinism. Where determinism is the thesis that events in the remote past in conjunction with the laws of nature entail as only one fixed future. I think ordinary folk generally feel that if determinism is true, we would lack the kind of free will needed to ground those kinds of attitudes, judgments, and treatments that I mentioned earlier. There is some evidence that ordinary folk may also have compatibilist intuitions, where they think you can be determined and free at the same time. But I think folk are not very clear, ordinary people are not very clear about their metaphysical commitments. They just assume we have a kind of free will, and they may be willing to use whatever account of free will is needed to justify holding on to blame and punishment. But in general, I think they think we have libertarian free will.
Yeah, I'm inclined to completely agree. I think nowadays, if you were to ask people, the average person probably walking on your local college campus is, do we have free will? I think many more people nowadays would be more sympathetic with the idea of cultural factors sort of, causing some issues there. But if you were to actually sort of ask them and interrogate them a bit more, saying, well, given the exact same history of the universe, I think the classic example often used, someone wakes up, you either have a cup of coffee or a cup of tea. Given the same exact conditions of the universe, same exact history, would you have been able to pick a cup of coffee instead of a cup of tea? And I think most people would say, I guess maybe, I'm not quite sure actually. But I would agree that most people outside of the college campus might say, well, have a more libertarian understanding of it, saying, well, of course, right? And even people who aren't religious, who sort of assume like a soul or something around that nature that could transcend the laws of physics, I think still people have this very powerful intuition that we could make decisions even outside the context of cultural and biological constraints. And I like that you mentioned determinism and compatibilism and libertarianism there, because when people think about free will and the debate about free will, those are usually the three positions that people kind of think of, where determinism, as you said, is basically just this causal network of events that must occur. And libertarianism is transcending that, and compatibilism is the belief that you can, you can't make determinism and free will compatible. And there's different people, different variations of that. But I feel like sometimes it can be more complex than that, because you do see people who are not determinists who nevertheless don't believe in free will either. I believe in the book Just Desserts you call yourself, you're more so a hard incompatibilist rather than a hard determinist. Would you mind going a bit, a bit?
Yeah. So backing it up a little bit, the traditional problem used to be, or was thought to be, a problem between free will and determinism. Again, where determinism is this sort of thesis that keeping everything fixed in the universe, that facts about the remote past in conjunction with the laws of nature entail that whatever happens is the only thing that could have happened, right? That if determinism is true, can we have free will? So there's generally, if the problem of free will and determinism, there's generally three views. One view is to say that determinism is true, and therefore we lack free will. That was called hard determinism. And that view said, if determinism is true, it's incompatible with free will, either because it's incompatible with an agent's ability to do otherwise. That is, like, if I chose this shirt today, people generally feel like I could have chosen a different shirt, or I could have had something different for breakfast. Determinism suggests that the thing that happens is the only thing that could have happened. And so hard determinists will say free will, if determinism is true, free will is impossible because either you couldn't have done otherwise, or agents are not the ultimate source of their actions. Their actions drain back to factors antecedent even to their own lives. Like you said, childhood experiences, how they were raised, cultural factors, genetic factors, issues having to do with brain chemistry and enculturation, and all these other factors are ultimately determining what we do. The other view is libertarianism, which says that essentially we do have free will, and free will is incompatible with determinism, so we have to reject the idea that, at least with regard to human behavior, everything is determined. And there are different kinds of libertarianism. And then the third view is compatibilism, that tries to reconcile determinism and free will and say you could be both free and causally determined. And the view there is generally something, there are different versions of this as well, but generally something like free will doesn't require the falsity of determinism. It just requires that actions are caused in some appropriate way. And usually that involves them being caused by the internal states of the agent, some kind of reasons, responsive mechanisms, facts about the agent themselves. I am technically neutral on the truth of determinism. And so, as you said, I view myself as a hard incompatibilist. So I argue that essentially, whether determinism is true or not, we would lack free will. And this is because I think both determinism and indeterminism are incompatible with the kind of control and action that's required for free will. I think determinism is incompatible with free will because it's incompatible with agents being the appropriate source of their actions. And so we could maybe go through some of the arguments against compatibilism. But I also think indeterminism wouldn't save free will. And so one way to see this is just, it depends on what kind of libertarian you are. But one kind of libertarianism just introduces indeterminacy at the level of events. So it says somewhere in the sequence of events leading up to my action, there's some indeterminacy involved that screens off all of these deterministic factors. It allows some freedom, some wiggle room maybe. Well, part of the problem with just introducing indeterminacy at some point in a sequence of physical events is agents would not be able to settle the outcomes of those indeterminate events. They would have no more control over the outcomes of an indeterminate event than they would have over a determined event. And so this is sometimes called the luck objection, that it seems just a matter of luck what ultimately happens if indeterminacy is the cause. Or I like to put it in terms of the agent would not be able to settle the outcome. So imagine you're making a choice between a cup of coffee or a cup of tea. And you're torn, you're undecided as to what to do, you're deliberating. And then some quantum fluctuation, some quantum event at some low level of neural activity in your brain occurs. And maybe it percolates up to the level of neural networks. And then ultimately, it affects what you choose. And say you choose the coffee. If the result of you, if you choosing the coffee is the result of this quantum indeterminacy, it seems that you, the agent, the individual, didn't settle your choice. And if you were to rewind the tape, like let's say you could rewind time and play it forward again over and over again, the agent wouldn't be playing any role in what happens. It would just be some probabilistic outcome where sometimes you choose coffee, sometimes you choose tea, and it has nothing to do with the nature of the agent. It has to do with some probabilistic events about indeterminate, quantum happenings. Another libertarian view is to say, well, there's more than that. There's an agent. And you mentioned souls and dualism before. This goes along with a lot of sort of religious views about free will, that maybe agents are more than just a collection of physical events. Maybe there's some kind of a self that's not reducible to lower level physical activity, and that this self is some kind of a unique substance in the world and is able to be the cause of their own actions. So on this account, the agent is some kind of uncaused cause. They're the cause of their own actions, but they themselves are not caused by their upbringing, their past, their brain chemistry, all that antecedent stuff. Well, that would, in my view, preserve what's needed. It would preserve the kind of free will that's needed for agents to be morally responsible in this deep sense. But I think it doesn't fit with our best philosophical and scientific theories about the world. So what my view essentially does is it goes through and looks at all the leading alternatives. It argues that each of these alternatives fail to preserve free will for various reasons. And as a result, the only remaining view left standing is free will skepticism. So I'm a free will skeptic, and as a free will skeptic, I essentially maintain that who we are and what we do is ultimately the result of factors beyond our control. Whether those factors be determinism or indeterminism, it doesn't matter, because those are both factors that are beyond the control of the agent. And as a result, we're never morally responsible for our actions in this, what I call basic desert sense, the sense needed for just desserts, for praise and blame, punishment and reward, grounded in the notion of desert.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I'm in complete agreement that even if determinism is not true, you still run into so many issues and try to justify free will. You do have the sociological and biological issues, and even with the biological ones, if someone says, well, if someone isn't gifted, let's say in mathematics, they have no choice in actually trying to attend a high-level university. And even if someone were to say, but that's a clear example of free will because they're not gifted, they weren't, the biological dice wasn't in their favor, but they could still work hard and get there. But someone could equally argue and say, but that relies on the fact that they were also born with the capacity to actually be able to work hard. So no matter what, it's, no matter what, you're screwed, right? Sometimes in these scenarios. But also, as you said, no, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, we could even make it a little easier for some listeners in some ways. I mean, I think, my views are worked out in terms of these issues about metaphysical accounts of the world, like determinism and indeterminism. But if those get too complicated, I just think luck is a problem for free will. Where luck is, so think about, like, there's philosophers talk about different types of luck, but one really well-known kind of luck is called constitutive luck. It's the kind of luck that constitutes you as an agent. It makes you the kind of agent you are, right? And constitutive luck seems to be the byproduct of factors beyond our control, just like determinism and indeterminism. That is, the parents you were born in, the society in which you were born is a matter of luck. It's a lottery of life. It's a roll of the dice. Whether you're born into an abusive household or in a loving household, or into a war-torn region of the world, or into poverty or wealth, whether you're born white or black, male or female, these are all factors of luck. Um, and then there's the luck of, then there's the luck as you go on in life, the luck of, did you have an encouraging teacher? Did you get a good break? Was there an opportunity or a club? Or even, as I mentioned at the beginning, the luck of meeting some individuals at college who were interested in philosophy and piqued my interest in going beyond music, right? Those are matters of luck. I don't control those. And those could be good or bad. Just like winning the lottery would be a good form of luck, and getting hit by a car is a bad form of luck. Um, and then there's what's called present luck, which is the luck around the time of action. This could be the luck of like what thoughts come to you in that particular moment, what reasons weigh most heavily on your decision, the luck of does your mind wander or not wander at the crucial moment of deliberation. It could also be the luck of like the color of the walls, the situational features of my environment that could be influencing me in ways I'm unaware of. Um, and what I would argue is that what agents ultimately do is a byproduct of both constitutive luck and present luck. Some form of either or both, generally probably both at some point. And luck undermines free will and moral responsibility just as determinism and indeterminism does, because luck, again, is agency undermining in the sense that factors of luck, factors of who we are as agents and the kinds of deliberations and actions and choices we make, if they're the byproducts of luck, they're the byproduct of factors beyond our control. So your example of the hardworking student who had to overcome some hardship, well, there's the initial bad luck of the hardship and the circumstances, but then there had to be some good luck in there as well. The good luck of maybe their genes or their heredity that made them kind of persevering character, a hardworking individual, or maybe the luck of an encouraging teacher or a break in school, or a helpful college counselor, or a professor along the way. That requires you have to have some breaks in life to succeed. And then there's the luck of being able to have the kind of luck that allows you to be a person that would exert the effort at the right time in the right way to allow you to succeed. And I would say that all of that makes us the agents we are. But if what makes us the agents we are the result of factors beyond our control, we don't ultimately have the kind of responsibility for our actions that ordinary people tend to think we do.
And it makes me wonder if, outside the context of the soul and anything like that, can you even come up with a coherent definition or a coherent understanding of what it would mean to actually have free will? Because even when you take out the sociological and biological factors and you sort of say, well, here's a decision that I made that's not affected by sociology, that's not affected by biology, then you get into the question as well, I think Sam Harris went so far as to say that the illusion of free will itself is an illusion, because you can't change your wants, you can't change your desires. And if you do say, well, okay, I want, Taco Bell right now, but in order to act against my desires, I will eat something that I don't want. Well, that in and of itself is a desire. And then, even something when you say, well, think of something random. Again, outside social factors, outside cultural contexts, just think of something random. And you think, okay, elephant, right? I don't live near elephants, nothing, that's completely random as far as I'm concerned. Well, exactly, you didn't decide, as far as you're concerned, that was just something random that came into you out of no control of your own. So I think, well, is there even a coherent understanding of what it actually means to make decisions on your own, that you are the author of these thoughts? I can't even think of a coherent definition of it. So I feel like I'm in agreement with Harris that says that the illusion itself is also an illusion. And, going into the main focus of the most recent book where you spar with Daniel Dennett, Just Desserts, what does this mean for responsibility? What does this mean for ethics? What does this mean for the judicial system? So do you have any closing thoughts on that before we also move on to the sort of the fun, legal issues that we...
Yeah. I mean, I tend to agree. I mean, there are philosophers that think there can be coherent accounts. I mean, a compatibilist could argue that as long as that action is the result of who I am as a person, and I take ownership over those aspects of myself, that are responsible or cause my choices, then that's all that's required. But my argument against the compatibilist view, um, probably the easiest way to see it is to kind of think of cases of manipulation, where agents are externally manipulated. So let's say there's some sort of device that's been implanted in your brain without your knowledge. And some team of neuroscientists can remotely trigger various neural states in you. And they trigger in you a want or a desire. Let's say the desire to, wear that shirt today. And so you chose to wear that shirt today based on your wants and your desires. Well, that would seem to satisfy the compatibilist definition of free will, because you'd be doing what you want. You would be acting based on your own inner psychological states. You'd be basing your actions on your own reasons. Many people, however, would have the really strong intuition that this person's not free because they're externally manipulated from some team of neuroscientists. I would argue that the same situation holds in the case of natural determinism. That in the case of natural determinism, that want that occurs in me itself, again, is being caused, if you're a compatibilist. It shouldn't matter whether it's caused by a team of neuroscientists or biology and sociology and upbringing and hereditary and genetic factors. If you're okay with those states being caused, it shouldn't matter how that cause arises. And what I would say is, if you think agents are not free and morally responsible in the case of manipulated situations and scenarios, then it carries over that there's no morally or philosophically relevant distinction between those cases of manipulation and the ordinary case of determinism. So we should conclude that in the ordinary case of determinism, agents would also lack free will and moral responsibility.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one of the most interesting arguments for compatibilism that I've come across is by Sean Carroll, who's a physicist, and he, and I do like that one of the things he says is that he doesn't use quantum indeterminacy as a way in order to try to jerry-rig the system and try to defend some version of free will. He's a compatibilist, yeah, and he says that you don't even need quantum indeterminacy for this at all, and which I like, because I'm not a physicist, so I don't know much about quantum systems or quantum mechanics, but I've always failed to sort of see a direct connection between the existence of quantum indeterminacy and the way in which decisions are made. But he says, his argument, and I find it interesting, is that we should view free will in the same way that we view something like baseball, as sort of a meta phenomenon, an emergent phenomenon, where no one describes or defines baseball in the sense of the quantum states that the players are required to undergo, or the position of the particles. You don't define it that way, because that's not the level of analysis that we're actually using. It's another one. It's another layer up. Similarly, free will could be viewed in that sense, where determinism, let's say, is true. Yes, you don't actually make any of these decisions on your own, but we view it as a sort of emergent phenomenon in the sense that it's a good description of human desires, of human accounts, of human interactions. And so in that sense, we should treat free will in the same way that we would treat baseball, or in the same way that we try to understand the way that we view temperature. No one defines temperature specifically based on like the position of the molecules and then how tightly packed they are with one another. But rather we say like, well, it's just this general feeling that we have, the temperature's low because it kind of feels cold. But my concern with that is that I get it, and I can sympathize with it, but the problem is that if it is the case that we don't have free will, there's a lot of ethical dilemmas that we're going to run into when it comes to understanding whether or not someone truly deserves to be punished. And so, in your most recent book that you wrote with, co-authored with Daniel Dennett, he, you argue against retributivism, which is this idea that people really do deserve to be punished, and that's outside the context of putting someone in prison for deterrent reasons, making sure that they don't commit the same crime, or making sure that you provide an example for society at large that they'll get punished if they do this harmful thing. Even if it were the case that they could be healed immediately, this idea that they still deserve it. My understanding, or my belief, I would say, is that no one truly really deserves anything. And so that's a huge issue that I don't think Sean Carroll's description really addresses. So, you know, what would you say are some of the main ethical dilemmas that we have to face once we come to grip with the fact that free will as we know it doesn't really exist?
Yeah, so that's a good setup. Yeah, I mean, a lot of skeptics, I mean, a lot of people who are, sorry, critics of free will skepticism think that if we adopt this view, it's going to lead to nihilism or despair or undermine meaning in life, or we just have to let criminals run free. What I've tried to do in my work is systematically go through different domains, the domains of morality and meaning, criminal justice, criminal law, interpersonal relationships, and argue that we could preserve most of what we would care about without the beliefs in free will and basic desert. And not only is it possible to live without these beliefs, it's beneficial. So one of the things, going back to like your description of Sean Carroll's view, is like, okay, well, let's just adopt it. And this is similar in some ways with Dan Dennett. Let's adopt it as a kind of social construct, you know, just like money and currency is a kind of social construct, and it's a useful construct. And so for Dennett and others, and maybe I don't know Sean's view that well, but maybe this construct he thinks is justified largely on the grounds that it's beneficial. And so you hear a lot of people who sort of now defend free will, not so much on the grounds that metaphysically we have evidence we have it, or that these arguments against it fail, but that we need it, like it's necessary. And I actually think they're wrong about that. I think they're wrong for a couple of reasons. I mean, one thing is that sometimes there's this straw man or just caricatured view of what my position is, or what a free will skeptic has to say. And if that's what we were saying, yeah, the world looks like it'd be in bad shape if we gave these things up. But I don't think that free will skeptics have to deny certain things that are very important to society. I think they could preserve morality. I think they could preserve concepts of right and wrong. I think they could preserve even certain kinds of moral protest and reasons for engaging in moral dialogue with individuals. And I think we could, part of my work in criminal justice is to build an account of what we would do in the context of addressing criminal behavior that I think would be more humane, more effective than retributivism. And all of it can be done, I argue, without assuming agents are deserving in some basic sense, or that they're morally responsible in the senses that free will entails. So if we want, we could go through some of those different areas. But I generally feel that the idea that the notion of just desserts to me is just too often used to justify punitive excess in criminal justice, to encourage treating people in severe and demeaning ways, to perpetuate social and economic inequality on the myth of like that individuals are self-made and that they deserve either their wealth or their failures or their poverty. So I actually think that the notions of just desserts and free will are actually more corrosive than they are beneficial. And once we abandon the idea that of free will, and with it the notion of just desserts, we can look more deeply into the causes and the systems that shape individuals and their behavior. And this could lead to more humane and effective and holistic approaches to addressing social ills.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my word, excuse me. Sorry, I woke up a bit sick. Yeah, so I am in complete agreement with you that I don't think there is a concern about society going rampant or losing their way if they were to be, told that by science that free will doesn't exist. You heard similar concerns, I think, earlier on, probably in the mid 2000s, like 2005, 2006, when there was the whole creationism debate about whether or not evolution was true and should be allowed in school. And one of the big concerns that a lot of people had was that, well, what happens if society stops believing that there is some purpose to their life? What happens if they adopt this materialistic account of life? And there's still many people arguing that to this day. And what I've always said was, you know, when you look at, data from Western European countries that are largely secular, they don't seem to have that issue. So I think this is very similar to that. I could be
I
wrong.
agree. Yeah, yeah. I mean, there was this widespread belief as secularization spread, as connects to your work and interest in religion, right? That if people gave up the concept of God, there'd be no fundamental foundation for morality. People would just run out, rape, murder, and steal. Um, and as you said, there are still people that believe that today, that we need God as a sort of fundamental foundation for morality. But empirically speaking, that hasn't been what we found, right? As nations have become more secular, um, it hasn't been the case that morality has completely eroded or disappeared. Um, and that's partly because I think people are more resilient than we think, that people are able to find other foundations for these kinds of institutions. And even though you may think that we need one concept to hold all of it up, I think it's kind of an illegitimate fear. And so I think the same people that are concerned that if we give up the belief in free will, it will lead to all of these detrimental effects in society, are essentially making the same mistake that people made in the past about the belief in the belief in God as a necessary feature of our social institutions. Um, and so now there are closer ties when it comes to free will and certain moral categories, because the concepts of free will are tied in with the concepts of moral responsibility. But what I want to suggest is that there are other concepts of responsibility that could be equally preserved, even if we reject the notion of basic desert moral responsibility.
Hmm. Yeah, completely agree. I think Jerry Coyne, the evolutionary biologist, even shared a meta-analysis of people who were determinists, who didn't believe in free will, versus those who believed in libertarian free will, and there was no disparity whatsoever in in ethics, in moral
Yeah.
systems. And so, yeah, I agree. I think it's just going to be another thing where people, worst case scenario, they sort of raise their eyebrows and say, "Wow, that's a pretty crazy finding." And then they go on with their lives, with their stats final that they have to worry about on Friday, with holding up their relationship, things that are occupied their minds more so than these philosophical questions. Nothing in their life is going to change. But what would you say are some of the biggest concerns, going back to what we were talking about, the judicial system and the way where we might have to reevaluate some things? What would you say are probably some of the biggest things that we might have to reevaluate once we come to grips with the reality that is, you know, the free will not being what we think it is?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest one for me is criminal justice and our concepts of um, legal punishment and criminal law. So, um, yeah, so I have written another book called Rejecting Retributivism, which develops this holistic and completely alternative account to how to address criminal behavior. Um, After I go through various reasons why we should reject retributivism, and by the way, there were additional reasons beyond the fact that it assumes free will, but there are many good reasons maybe we want to reject it. But um, if agents aren't truly deserving of punishment in the way that we typically think, then one concern people have is, well, what are we going to do with really dangerous criminals? So my account is called the public health quarantine model. So if you want, I could run through this real fast. But I'll start with the quarantine part of the equation. So the beginning part comes from work that Dirk Pureboom has done, and now we've developed this theory together as well. Um, so the idea would be something like this: that, if free will skeptics are right, agents are never truly deserving in the basic sense to be blamed or punished for their wrongdoing. But many people who have communicable diseases are not responsible in this sense or any sense for having contracted those communicable diseases. So, like, if I were to fly to meet you in person to do this interview, and somewhere along the way I contract Ebola, and I test positive at the airport for Ebola, I think everyone would agree that the state would be justified in limiting my liberty, i.e., in quarantining me. And the justification for quarantine in this case would be grounded, at least in my model, in the right of self-defense and prevention of harm to others. That is, the state would be justified in restricting my liberty by quarantining me, and the justification would be grounded in the need to prevent a pandemic and to protect public health and safety. And so when you think about that justification, and it in no way appeals to free will, moral responsibility, retribution, just desserts. In fact, we typically in that case we assume the agent's not responsible for having Ebola and doesn't deserve blame or punishment in any way. And yet we're still justified in restricting their liberty. So what I would offer is an analogous account that says so it's an incapacitation account. We could justify incapacitating seriously dangerous criminals like child molesters and serial killers on the grounds analogous to the justification for quarantine, i.e. based in the right of self-defense and prevention of harm to others. And we could justify incapacitating these seriously dangerous criminals without appealing to free will or moral responsibility or just desserts or blame or retribution. So we could justify protecting society, restricting the liberty of individuals. However, if we adopt that approach, some really massive reforms immediately follow. So for one, I don't see this not only as it's not a retributive account, but I don't even see this as a punitive account. That is, we don't, by any proper definition of punishment, we don't punish the Ebola patient when we restrict their liberty. We're restricting their liberty because we have to, but we're not punishing them in the sense that punishment typically also involves a condemnation of the individual or the individual's actions. So it has this communicative function. We're condemning the individual. It also involves intentionally imposing harsh treatment or harm on the individual by punishing them. We're not doing any of that in the case of quarantine. So this would mean that for me, the purpose of incapacitation would be focused more on rehabilitation and reintegration than on punishment. So if you were holding me in the airport because I have Ebola, the story doesn't end there. You have a moral duty to treat me and then release me the minute I'm no longer a threat to public health. And so the goal of the criminal justice system should be similar. It should be aimed at rehabilitation and reintegration. Second, just like the Ebola patient may have his liberty restricted, no other rights can be removed. Like, we can't justify disenfranchising this person, taking away their voting rights, stripping them of basic human dignity, preventing them from applying to public housing. So on my model, all individuals should retain all their other basic rights. The only right the state could justify removing in this instance is their liberty because it's necessary to protect public safety. Lastly, the institutions themselves would have to be redesigned. Their purposes, like our institutions, just even the physical space of prisons, are designed for punitive purposes. These institutions would have to become more humane and would have to focus more on being designed in ways that elicit and effectively rehabilitate individuals. But another big part of it is we have to think about who we incapacitate, the length for which we incapacitate, and the reasons why. So the vast majority of people currently in prison in the United States right now are really serve no serious threat to public safety. In fact, there was a Brenner study that found that over 500,000 people today could be released from prison with zero increase in concern to public safety. And that's because the vast majority of them are serving terms for nonviolent offenses or have aged out of their criminal, tendencies. Like, for example, we know that at certain ages, people's likelihood of committing future violent offenses begins to drop dramatically. And at some point, like when you get to 70, 80, 90-year-old people who have literally been in prison for many, the duration of their lives, the recidivism rates go down to almost zero. Many of these people could be released with very little increase in threat to public safety. Second to that, the vast majority of these people, in fact, over 50% of people in the United States prisons are suffering from a diagnosable mental illness. Many of them would be better served with mental health services. And the other vast majority are people who are serving either for possession crimes or crimes committed due to addiction. Many of them would be better served with drug treatment. So we would look for less, I call it the principle of least infringement. You have to adopt the least restrictive measure necessary to protect public safety. And in many of these instances, less restrictive measures are available to us. And so we would drastically reduce mass incarceration on my model. The United States makes up 4.5% of the world's population, relatively small. Yet we house 25% of the world's prisoners. That's the largest rate of incarceration known to civilization. No society has ever incarcerated that many people. We incarcerate roughly 700 people for every 100,000. We have a mass incarceration problem. And 1 out of every 31 Americans is somewhere in the criminal justice system. Just think about that. Probation, parole, jail, prison, somewhere in that net is 1 out of 31 Americans. Maybe we've over-criminalized things. My model is also consistent with the decriminalization of certain types of offenses that maybe shouldn't be criminalized in the first place. And it's consistent with offering alternative options for treatment to incarceration for people that would be better served with mental health or addiction services, or even social programs that would, link them up with job creation and housing programs. The other part, sorry I'm going on so long here, but the other part, and I think this is the key part from my model, is the public health part. So I owe people a story of what do we do with dangerous criminals if we give up free will. Well, I just gave you that story. But I think the myopic focus and obsession with punishment is getting in the way of true criminal justice reform. So what I want to do is reorient things away from a reactive approach to crime that deals with crime after it occurs through the forms of punishment and blame, to a preventative approach that focuses on prevention and social justice. And so public health is a good way to do this because the public health frameworks that have been developed over centuries and have been used in all kinds of different public health arenas essentially do this already. What they're designed to do is to identify the social determinants of poor health outcomes. Like things like poverty affects, type 2 diabetes rates, morbidity rates, heart disease rates. You identify these social determinants of health, you prioritize them, and then you figure out through targeted programs how to deal and address those systemic causes of poor health outcomes. So in my work, what I've argued is that the social determinants for criminal behavior are essentially analogous to the social determinants of health. And I've gone through exhaustive studies to show how poverty, mental health, environmental health, nutrition, housing, access to health care, all of these things not only affect health outcomes, they affect incarceration rates. So once you take a broader approach, you start to see that criminal behavior is more a byproduct of circumstances than people. It's more a byproduct of broken social structures, like poverty, low socioeconomic status. Take violence, for example, exposure to violence. 90% of women currently imprisoned in the United States have been previously victims of violence. 90%. That's either domestic violence, sexual assault, child abuse, some form of trauma through violence has affected their lives in a way that has led to their incarceration. Yeah, we have to protect society from dangerous people, but we want to prevent people from being victimized to begin with to lead to lives that involve them within the criminal justice system. And you can't get higher statistic than 90%. I mean, that's an amazing statistic. Yeah, sure, you could blame these women for committing criminal acts, but many of them are performing these criminal acts either because the domestic violence has affected their ability to hold steady jobs. If you look at the statistics, unemployment rates are much higher among women who have been abused. And so due to their unemployment, they may resort to petty crime. to get by. That gets them involved in the criminal justice system. Many of them are wrapped up in abusive relationships that are compounded by addiction. So there's these confounds, like maybe there's drugs involved in addition to the violence. And sometimes they commit criminal acts at the behest of their abusers or to feed their addictions because of the abuse has created psychological damage. So there's all these reasons why these women are ending up in the criminal justice system once they've been victimized. But this hard and fast distinction between victim and perpetrator is an illusion. Most of the people if you look at the lives of people who are in prison right now in the United States, you will find that their lives are filled with all kinds of trauma. And so in this more systemic, holistic approach, the public health framework allows us to reorient things to the bringing people's attention away from individual responsibility, which if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Well, if you focus on everything through the lens of individual responsibility, the appropriate response to crime is punishment. But we know it doesn't work. We have one of the highest recidivism rates in the country, and yet we're an extremely retributive society. We have a mass incarceration problem, but it's not reducing crime. And so maybe even regardless of whether you believe in free will or not, maybe we should take a different approach. And so one of these alternative approaches that's consistent with my free will skepticism, it doesn't require it, but it's consistent with it, is to reorient this focus toward addressing the social injustices that lead to the criminal behavior in the first place.
I'm glad you brought that up because, as many people might get the impression that talking about free will, talking about whether or not people actually deserve what they get, many people probably would be under the impression that that's really just like a very esoteric, philosophical, fun thing to talk about. But there are some genuine societal ramifications that constructing a society that believes in free will has. I remember Paul Bloom, he was talking about this when he was arguing against empathy, but it also, makes me think about this, where he says, the victim testimony has such a powerful, it can heavily influence the jury's decision and whether or not someone is going to go to prison for 10 years or 7 years or 5 years because of the sense of, but deserving of punishment that the person deserves based on how emotionally affected the individual was. I mean, that's a clear case in which, just that sense of people deserving these things can influence what's going to happen to them in the future. 10 years in prison versus 3. Completely disregarding the actual negative effects of that outcome and not really taking into consideration, well, how do we actually fix the situation? How do we make sure that this person either is rehabilitated, doesn't make this mistake again, or how do we make sure other people don't do it in the future? I mean, these are genuine questions, societal questions that often get brushed under the rug. I was thinking to myself, well, not only will a free will libertarian not like this, but libertarians won't like this either, political libertarians. But these are genuine issues. These are genuine questions that something as seemingly esoteric as the question of free will actually has genuine ramifications. And so we run into the problem of how do we communicate this to the public? Very difficult to manage to communicate these sorts of topics in a way that is comprehensible, understandable to the general public, especially when we live in a society in which, as I said, people have statistics finals to worry about on Friday, and it doesn't really affect them. It's a lot hard, but that's why I'm glad we have people such as yourself who's able to really talk about these philosophical issues and work on them in a way in which it is actually, affecting society at large when it comes to reforming the criminal justice system.
Well, thank you.
Mm-hmm. But we're coming up on the hour, and I think that's actually a great way to end it. But this was, I absolutely love this conversation. I know a lot of people listening will probably say that, well, you agreed with him a lot. And my answer is, yeah, because I do. I agree that free will does not exist. And I've read Daniel Dennett's book, Elbow Room. I actually have it here, actually, which is, it's a fun book. I remember reading it on my way to class, but I don't agree with it. And but I'm glad I was able to have you on and pick your brain and your thoughts, and hopefully people will be able to get out a lot of this conversation. I'm sure they will. But Dr. Caruso, so what is it that you're working on right now, and where can people find you?
Yeah, I have a new book that just came out today, which is a co-authored book with Dirk Pierreboom called it's called Moral Responsibility Reconsidered, and it actually does cover a lot of these same topics where we talk about what adopting this perspective on free will and moral responsibility would mean for morality and interpersonal relationships. And we talk a lot about certain types of states like moral anger and blame. The next book after that is I'm working on a book on neurolaw, which will be about how developments in the neurosciences can and will and already are affecting the criminal law. So that's what I'm working on now. And people can find my work and more about me at my website, which is www.greggcaruso.com. So just one word, GREGGCARUS.
Okay. Well, thank you once more for joining me in this conversation. It was great. I hope you have a great day. Congratulations on the release of your new book, and eagerly awaiting to read future books.